At the dawn of time, long before borders and flags, the vast lands that would one day be called Canada were carved by glaciers, rivers, and the will of nature itself. Here the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples thrived for thousands of years. Nations of hunters, traders, and storytellers who lived in harmony with the forests, the tundra, and the coasts. From the Haida of the Pacific Northwest with their towering totem poles, to the Cree of the prairies and the Inuit of the Arctic Circle, each community developed its own culture, language, and spiritual bond with the land. They traded along routes older than memory and built societies guided by balance and respect. Then, in the late 15th century, sails appeared on the eastern horizon. The arrival of European explorers, first the Vikings in Newfoundland, then John Cabot in 1497 under the English flag, and Jacques Cartier claiming the St. Lawrence River for France in 1534, marked the beginning of a new and complex chapter. The French built their settlements along the St. Lawrence, founding Quebec City and Montreal, spreading Catholic missions and fur trading networks deep into the continent. The British, expanding from their coastal colonies, sought dominance over this vast land, igniting centuries of rivalry that would shape Canada's destiny. The 17th and 18th centuries were defined by wars, not just between empires but within alliances that involved Indigenous nations like the Huron, Algonquin, and Iroquois, whose allegiances determined the fate of battles. The climactic 7 Years' War, ending in 1763, saw France cede almost all its North American territories to Britain. Canada became British, but not fully English. The French-speaking population, deeply rooted in their Catholic faith and distinct culture, remained, and so began Canada's enduring struggle between two identities, English and French, British and Quebecois. Through the American Revolution, Canada stood as a northern refuge for loyalists fleeing the new republic to the south. Their arrival reshaped demographics, bringing English-speaking settlers to Ontario and the Maritimes. Yet even as Canada grew, it remained a mosaic. Indigenous, French, British, and later waves of immigrants from Europe and Asia, all layering identities on the same soil. In 1867, the dream of uniting the scattered colonies into one dominion became reality through Confederation. The leaders, John A. Macdonald, George Etienne Cartier, and others, forged a compromise, a federal nation that balanced unity with provincial autonomy. The Dominion of Canada was born, under the British Crown but with its own parliament, its own flag soon to come, and its own path to follow. The 19th century saw expansion westward. The building of the Canadian Pacific Railway linked the Atlantic to the Pacific, fulfilling the promise of a transcontinental nation, but at a devastating cost to Indigenous peoples whose lands were seized and treaties broken. The residential school system, now recognized as one of the darkest chapters in Canadian history, sought to erase Indigenous culture under the guise of assimilation, leaving trauma that echoes across generations. Yet Canada also became a refuge for others, escaped slaves from the United States, immigrants from Ireland, Scotland, China, and Ukraine, all arriving with hope of freedom and land. The new century brought new trials. Canada fought bravely in World War I, from Vimy Ridge to Passchendaele, where thousands died for a country still defining itself. The war fostered national pride but also deep divisions, especially over conscription between English and French Canadians. The Great Depression of the 1930s tested resilience again. Unemployment soared, protests erupted, and yet communities endured. Then came World War II, where Canada once again stood firm, landing on the beaches of Normandy, liberating the Netherlands, and earning international respect as a fighting force. After the war, Canada embraced a new identity: peacekeeper, builder, and mediator on the world stage. The 1960s brought transformation: the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, the rise of bilingualism, the maple leaf flag in 1965 symbolizing a new independent spirit. In 1982, the Constitution was patriated from Britain, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was born, enshrining equality, justice, and individual liberty as the heart of the nation. Canada's multiculturalism, officially recognized in 1971, became its defining strength, drawing people from every corner of the globe to a country built on diversity. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought new challenges: debates over Quebec sovereignty, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and the balancing act between resource wealth and environmental protection. Canada grew into one of the most developed, inclusive nations on Earth, yet still wrestles with its colonial past. Today, under the northern lights and the vast skies that stretch from Newfoundland to British Columbia, Canada stands as a nation of contrasts, old and new, native and immigrant, tradition and innovation. Its cities, from Toronto's skyline to Vancouver's harbors, pulse with diversity. Its wilderness remains vast and untamed. Canada leads in technology, education, and human rights, while championing global peace, climate action, and equality. But beneath its calm exterior lies an ongoing dialogue about identity, what it truly means to be Canadian in a world that is constantly changing. It is a story still being written, from the ancient footsteps of the First Nations to the digital era of today. Canada endures as a land of resilience, reconciliation, and quiet strength, forever shaped by its history, yet always reaching for a better future. As the 20th century dawned, Canada stood at the edge of transformation, an emerging nation straddling tradition and progress, still tethered to the British Empire, yet determined to carve out its own identity in the modern world. The discovery of vast natural resources, timber, minerals, oil, and fertile farmlands, ignited waves of industrialization that pulled settlers westward and created booming cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Immigration surged, reshaping Canada's social fabric with waves of Europeans seeking new beginnings in the Great White North. But with growth came growing pains, cultural tensions, regional divisions, and the challenge of balancing English and French identities. When World War I erupted in 1914, Canada's loyalty to Britain pulled it into a conflict that would forever change the nation. Over 600,000 Canadians enlisted, and their courage at battles like Vimy Ridge in 1917 forged a new national pride, a moment many historians call the birth of a nation. Yet, the cost was devastating. More than 60,000 dead, countless wounded, and a generation scarred by loss. After the war, the 1920s brought prosperity, followed by the Great Depression, when unemployment and hardship tested Canada's resilience. Out of this turmoil rose new political movements, like the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the forerunner of today's NDP, and social reforms that began shaping Canada's modern welfare state. Then came World War II, and once again, Canada answered the call. Over 1 million Canadians served overseas. Their valor in battles from Hong Kong to Normandy earned global respect. On the home front, Canada's factories roared to life, producing weapons, vehicles, and aircraft that supplied Allied forces. The war transformed Canada's economy and elevated its diplomatic standing. When peace returned in 1945, Canada was no longer a colonial dependent. It was a respected middle power, a founding member of the United Nations and later NATO. Under Prime Minister Mackenzie King, and later Lester B. Pearson, Canada's foreign policy matured. Pearson, who would win the Nobel Peace Prize for creating the UN peacekeeping concept during the Suez Crisis, defined Canada's image as a global peacemaker. The post-war decades brought immense change. New provinces joined Confederation, most notably Newfoundland and Labrador in 1949, completing Canada's map as we know it. Economic growth soared through the 1950s and 60s, fueled by manufacturing, hydroelectric projects, and a booming oil industry in Alberta. At the same time, a cultural awakening swept the nation. Artists, musicians, and writers began to express a distinctly Canadian voice, breaking free from British and American influences. But beneath prosperity, old tensions simmered. In Quebec, many French-speaking Canadians felt marginalized, fueling the quiet revolution of the 1960s, a peaceful but powerful movement demanding social reform, economic control, and cultural pride. It was during this period that the slogan, "Vive le Québec libre," echoed around the world, symbolizing the province's quest for autonomy. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Canada's charismatic and controversial prime minister, met that challenge with bold vision. His government introduced official bilingualism and multiculturalism, redefining Canada as a mosaic rather than a melting pot. Trudeau also patriated the Constitution in 1982, giving Canada full control over its laws and adding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a monumental step in defining Canadian democracy and individual liberty. Yet, even as the Charter united Canadians under common principles, the country continued to wrestle with regional disparities, Western alienation, Indigenous struggles for justice, and Quebec's repeated pushes for independence, most notably in the 1980 and 1995 referendums. Each time, Canada's federation held firm, strengthened by dialogue, democracy, and compromise, a testament to its enduring resilience. The late 20th century saw Canada navigating the tides of globalization. Under leaders like Brian Mulroney, Jean Chrétien, and Stephen Harper, Canada deepened its economic ties with the United States through free trade agreements like NAFTA, boosting its economy but also sparking debates about sovereignty and dependence. The rise of multiculturalism became a defining feature of modern Canada. Cities like Toronto and Vancouver emerged as some of the most diverse in the world, where dozens of languages are spoken and cultures coexist in relative harmony. Indigenous voices, long silenced by colonial policies, began demanding truth and reconciliation. The tragic legacy of residential schools came to light, forcing Canada to confront its past and acknowledge the suffering of generations of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, launched in the 2000s, marked a turning point, a national reckoning that continues to shape the country's conscience. In the 21st century, Canada emerged as one of the most stable, democratic, and prosperous nations on Earth. Its economy, powered by natural resources, technology, and education, ranks among the world's largest. It consistently scores high on human development, quality of life, and global reputation indices. Yet Canada is not without its modern challenges. The debates over climate change, Indigenous land rights, immigration, and national unity persist. The country's vast oil sands wealth has made it a global energy player, but also a flashpoint in environmental politics. The COVID-19 pandemic tested the strength of its healthcare and governance systems, but Canada's collective response reflected its hallmark values: compassion, science, and cooperation. On the international stage, Canada continues to punch above its weight, participating in peacekeeping missions, promoting human rights, and balancing its relations with global powers like the US, China, and the European Union. Today, Canada stands as a living paradox: frozen wilderness and vibrant cities, rooted traditions and bold innovation, English and French, old and new. From the early explorations of Cartier and Champlain to the constitutional patriation of 1982, from the fur trade to space exploration, from Indigenous heritage to digital age diplomacy, Canada's journey is one of evolution, resilience, and quiet strength. Its story is not one of conquest or revolution, but of patience, negotiation, and vision, a rare kind of power that builds bridges instead of walls. And as the red maple leaf flutters against the northern sky, it symbolizes a nation still writing its story, a country vast enough for countless dreams, humble enough to listen, and strong enough to stand united in its diversity. Canada, from colony to confederation, from frontier to modern powerhouse, remains one of humanity's greatest experiments in coexistence. A place where history and hope meet beneath the same endless northern light.